you are equally welcome, of course. Our Dignity community spreads across the U.S., including Hawaii, and we are welcoming an inclusive group of folks, as you might imagine. So we're really happy to have you all tonight. And I want to first go through some instructions. I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. If you think I'm too soft or too loud, you can adjust my volume on your computer. And if that doesn't help, you can send a message via the chat box, which is there on the left-hand bottom side of your screen underneath the attendee list. And we're privileged tonight to have in the back of the house Logan Bear and Peggy Burns, colleagues of mine on the staff of Dignity USA, and they are here for you tonight. So if you are having difficulties with your connection, send a note via the chat box, please, and let them know if you're having troubles, and they'll do their best to help you out. Now, oftentimes the issue might be with your connection. It often depends on the strength of your own computer connection. If I am freezing or our guest is freezing, and you hear that in our conversation, like one of us is interrupting the other, or if you hear delay in the conversation, it may be because your connection is slow. But if many of you attending tonight are having that problem, then it could be the issue, my issue, or our guest's issues. So we want to hear if you're having difficulty, because if we hear from enough of you that are having the same difficulty, then it might be our problem on our end. Okay, we want you to have the smoothest possible experience as possible. And remember that in the last half of our hour tonight, you get to ask our theologian guests some of your own questions. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. Rather than use the chat box, and the chat box you can use to converse with each other, to make comments about what you're hearing, and talk to individuals. You see the send to everyone there at the bottom of the chat box. You click on that, and you can send a message to anyone in particular, a private message to any of those on the list in particular if you want, okay? But let me direct your attention to the top of your screen. The top of your screen, you will see an icon with the word notes underneath it. I hope you can see that. It's at the top of the screen above my image. If you click on that, you should then see a box open, a notes box. This is where I'd like you to ask your questions tonight. Now, you can ask your questions at any time in the hour during our interview in the first 30 minutes and during the question and answer time, the last 20 minutes of the hour. Anytime, please post your questions in that box underneath shared public notes, okay? That way I can see those questions easily rather than having to sift through the chat box conversation to find your good questions. So again, place your questions in that box. Now you'll see another box below that, your private notes. These are your notes and your notes only, okay? So you are welcome to write notes to yourself in the hour, and then you will be emailed those notes after the webinar. So here's a little bit of an explanation about that in the slide that you see on your screen. Public notes, ask questions in that box. Private notes, write whatever you need to write for yourself. That's for you and you only. All right. And again, please turn off all internet programs on your device in order to enhance your connection. Also, it helps if no one else is sharing your internet connection on another device, especially if they're watching videos or a movie. That could take some strength from your connection. And if your device audio is make sure your device audio is unmuted and at full strength, or at a strength that is comfortable for you. And then one last thing before I invite our guest, Richard Gaillardi to the screen. I'm going to give this a try. We haven't done this yet this season, but I'm going to give this a try. I want to offer a poll here. So you should see a poll in front of you. If you want to just click on how you identify there, and we'll see if this works. It's all anonymous, so you're just a number and a percentage. Make sure you submit vote at the bottom of that polling box. Excellent. We've got 50 of 63 folks, 52. All right, I'm going to put up one last poll before we bring our guest on here. Which of these film titles comes closest to your faith and or spirituality? Not the movie itself, but just the title. Don't think too hard. We don't have all night. We've got some very hopeful people online here. And a few wild ones, too. Nobody's faith that's gone with, well, a few whose faith has gone with the wind. I appreciate the honesty there. And some are still thinking. All right. Well, I am eager to bring on our guest tonight. Professor Richard Gaillardetz is a professor of theology at Boston College, and he is a dynamic speaker. I have seen and heard him a couple times. He crosses the country, and I imagine he also crosses the ponds and presents to worldwide audiences. And he speaks in a language I think that's accessible to us, and he knows his theology. And I am really excited to have him on tonight. And currently, Professor Gaillardetz is also the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. I don't know if that's like a 30 or 40 or 50-year term or what, but let's hope he's on for a little while longer here. So, Professor, if you want to come on screen, and we'll get rolling here. And again, attendees, I want to remind you to get your questions ready. There he is, Professor Gaillardetz. Nice to have you on tonight.
My pleasure.
Great. Folks, again, if you can't hear Professor Gaillardetz well, let us know, or if you hear him too well, let us know too. And if enough of you are having the same experience, we'll make adjustments on our end, okay? Thank you. So, Richard, I want to start first with a personal question. So take you out of your head for just a minute here and into your gut, or at least your memory. And are there any experiences in your young age when you had an inkling that this is the thing you wanted to do, is to move into this beautiful discipline of theology? What inspired you to this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I was raised Catholic, and when I went to the University of Texas in Austin, Texas, I was very attracted to some friends of mine who were evangelical Christians. And I left the Catholic Church and got very involved in a evangelical Christian movement called Campus Crusade for Christ. And early in college was involved with them. And I still treasure some very positive experiences with some wonderful people who had a very sincere faith and an incredible sense of hospitality and generosity of spirit. But I found that there was a kind of lurking anti-intellectualism that was hard for me to deal with. And so I started experiencing some tensions there. And right about that time, I had a good friend who invited me to come go to Mass at the Catholic Student Center, which was staffed by the Paulist priest there at the University of Texas. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have any real negative feelings about the Catholic Church anymore, so I went. And I met a remarkable Catholic priest who essentially suggested to me that it was possible that some of my difficulties with Catholicism had to do with the fact that I had sort of learned a child's kind of Catholicism, the kind of simple, black and white answers you get when you're preparing for First Communion and the sacraments, and that I ought to kind of learn a little bit about an adult Catholicism. And so I started doing some adult ed stuff, and they had a big library there, and I'll never forget the first time I just came across this book by some theologian. I didn't even quite know how to pronounce his name, named Karl Rahner, and read that book, and just a whole world opened up to me. And I remember a famous Catholic speaker who'd once introduced himself by saying, "I'm a Catholic first by birth, and then by choice, and now by love." And I think that describes me very much. I was born a Catholic. I chose to come back, and then I just fell in love with the capacious breadth and complexity of our Catholic intellectual heritage, a tradition that invited me to wrestle with tough questions and to doubt and to challenge, but gave me a spiritual home. And the more I read, the more I studied, the more I wanted to know. And that ultimately led to a doctorate in theology.
Very cool. What's of the mysteries of our Christian faith, what gets you most excited personally?
Well, I think there are times in my life when I have struggled with almost every major tenet of our faith, except one. The one tenet of our faith that has always captured me is what we call in the Catholic tradition the Paschal Mystery. The paradox that you only find life and fulfillment and meaning when you abandon the search for happiness and fulfillment and meaning and give yourself over to love of others. And as paradoxical as that is to me the most powerful insight of our Christian tradition, that until we die to a kind of a self-absorbed narcissistic existence, we can't rise to genuine joy and grace and delight. And I think that's been borne true over and over in my life and relationships and the testimony of people around me.
Wonderful. And what's the greatest stress in your work these days?
Well, I wear a lot of hats these days. So as you said, I'm the president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and this is probably a good moment for me to point out very clearly and explicitly that I am not representing that professional society here. I am speaking exclusively for myself. It is a wonderful organization of some 1,400 theologians from across the theological spectrum, and that's a particular hat that I wear. I value that because I think the vocation of theology is an important one, and there are a lot of tensions in our church today between theologians and church authority, and one of the opportunities that I have as president of our society is to play a very modest role in helping to mediate some of those disputes and keep more healthy lines of communication going with the bishops and foster a better environment for Catholic theologians to do their work. That takes, a good deal of my time. I'm also director of our program of graduate studies at Boston College. We have over 70 students pursuing a PhD in theology, and it's a great privilege of mine to be able to mentor some of those students.
I want to go back to the mention of the bishops and yours and the other theologians' relationship with the bishops. Some would say, in fact, some who have great influence and authoritative power in our church would say that theologians are here in order to help us understand the teachings that have been put before us by the hierarchical magisterium of the church. It's not the role of the theologian to interpret in such a way that there's much innovation of the teachings that are put before us. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of our faith. Look, there's an element of what theologians do that is strictly speaking catechetical. And many of us, most of us, the vast majority of us are practicing Catholics ourselves. We go to Mass on Sunday. We want to grow in Christian holiness and pass on the faith to others. And so we're happy to be in situations in our parishes or adult education series where we're playing more of a catechetical role, where our job is primarily to explain the fundamentals of the Christian faith. And most of us consider that a great privilege that we can do that. But that's not the primary responsibility of the theologian. And the primary responsibility of the theologian is to break open our faith, to explore its enduring significance, to consider new questions, new ways of making the Christian faith relevant to a complex, changing world. And so a good part of what we do is provisional and experimental in character. You know, we're not like the bishops. I mean, the bishops in the Catholic faith, they have an authoritative teaching office. Their position is by definition conservative. And I mean that in the best sense. Bishops aren't called to be innovative thinkers.
Right.
They're called to be conservative and safeguard the faith. And I respect that. But the theologian's task is different. The theologian has to ask tough questions. The theologian has to have the courage to say some of our traditional ways of articulating the faith no longer speak to people, or they need to be reconsidered in light of new questions and new insights. And so so I'll leave it at that. Go ahead.
Well, I want to break in only to say that it seems to me, with the few things I have heard or read of what Francis has to say when it comes to theologians, that you're speaking his language, or he is speaking your language here, but I have not heard that language spoken previously. But would you agree that Francis is intimating that, in fact, how you describe a theologian's job is indeed how he would describe it?
Well, in fact, I can tell you emphatically that it's how he describes it, because he just did within the last 24 hours in a document that I heartily recommend that everybody read, though it's
we've all read it.
80 plus pages, I'm sure everybody has. So it's an apostolic exhortation, which is a fancy term for a document that's promulgated after there was a synod of bishops, and it's the Pope's reflection on the fruit of that synod, which was on the new evangelization last year. And the title of the document is Evangelii Gaudium. And in it, he said very clearly that the magisterium looks to exegetes, which is our fancy term for biblical scholars, exegetes and theologians, to help the magisterium be more mature in its judgments, in its doctrinal judgments. That is, he recognizes, and this is one of the remarkable things about Pope Francis, he certainly believes in our doctrinal tradition, but he doesn't think that the doctrines are sealed up in some, hermetically sealed container. He understands that our doctrinal tradition is always in history, right? And is always being reinterpreted in new situations, in new contexts. And so he understands that theologians play a valuable role in helping the church grow in its insight about the essentials of the Christian faith.
And do you feel liberated by that, or did you not need to hear that to already be liberated in the work that you're about?
I was pretty confident before Pope Francis that that's what theologians are supposed to be doing. But I have to say, as a Catholic, it's kind of nice to have the Pope, saying the same things. I've had a long period of time where, though I always uphold the papacy in very high regard, I have had to sometimes reluctantly and respectfully take issue with a number of positions of our previous pontiffs. It is a special delight for me as a theologian to be able to write and talk and say wonderful, positive things about this Pope. And I had positive things to say about his predecessors as well. But look, there's no way around this. Theologians really, in many ways across the spectrum, consider this Pope a wonderful breath of fresh air.
Now, I haven't read it myself. I have read excerpts and quotes from it, and actually I'm very excited about some of the things he's putting forth in this exhortation. But I will have to say that I'm deeply discouraged that he's repeated again that the church has no power to ordain women to the priesthood, and I hear that, and this is my opinion. I find that to be a cowardice position. You know, it's like Pontius Pilate washing the blood from his hands. But I want to ask you this, Professor. In the history of the church, are you aware of any point where a pope or church leaders have said as much about something that the church has no power to change such and such, but then subsequently in the future a pope or a council in fact does say, well, the church does have some power or changes are made? Are you aware of any instance like that?
Well, yeah, I think the tradition is filled with examples where we are, look, the Catholic Church, first of all, if you don't mind, let me just go back. I want to fill in a little bit to about your statement on the ordination of women, if you will. First of all,
sure.
I don't think he actually used the language. The language you use comes from Ordinatio Sacerdotalis of Pope John Paul II. He does say that the ordination of women is not open for discussion. And I found that, not surprising, but also somewhat disappointing. But I should point out that he did not talk about it in the language of unchanging truths, which is a category of church teaching that he does mention in Evangelii Gaudium, but he doesn't mention this teaching in that category. It's also quite striking that he does not footnote Pope John Paul II's Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. Rather, he footnotes a much older document from Pope Paul VI, which did not give as much authority to the church's teaching on the ordination of women. Now, I've just had a couple of email exchanges with some colleagues today because we found that a little bit curious that he wouldn't footnote Pope John Paul II's document. The reason is that document from Pope John Paul II upped the doctrinal status of that teaching. So what you said was certainly true, but on the other hand, I would have to say his treatment of that was one sentence. He did not make a big deal of it. He did not offer a big theological rationale. And I think it was really articulated more in the context of really there's so many more important things that we as a church should be talking about, and he wanted to focus on that. But to answer your question, sure, there are all sorts of times. If you look at Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors in the 1860s, he condemned in some of the most stringent language that's, the stupidity of anybody daring to suggest that there was a primacy of conscience and that people should follow their conscience at all costs. I mean, in the 19th century, that was considered, a heresy by Pope Pius IX. And in several documents at the Second Vatican Council, it's made a core teaching of the Church. So that's but one of many examples where there's been significant shifts in the Church's teaching. Unfortunately, one of the difficulties of the Catholic Church, and I believe that having a formal teaching office, an episcopate, and a papacy is actually an important part of our faith. But for some time now, I'm afraid, our church leaders have been operating under what I think is actually a mistaken notion. They think that unless you articulate a teaching with absolute authority, you're going to lose credibility as a teacher. And so we have a tendency for our leaders to articulate every teaching as if it had the highest degree of authority and as if there was absolute certitude associated with it.
Right.
And I think that's a mistake because I think humanly people recognize that we exercise authority with varying degrees of certitude. I mean, as a parent, there were rules that my wife and I had that governed actions in our home, that you don't do violence to one another and so on and so forth. These were absolute rules. We never were second-guessing ourselves on those things. But there were many other judgments that we made with our children, and I'm aware that two of them are online here, so they could challenge me on this. Where we would second-guess ourselves. Where we weren't always sure that we were making the right decision. But I think as a parent, just because you're not absolutely sure, it doesn't mean you can abdicate your responsibilities. And I wish our bishops were clearer that there's nothing wrong with saying, here and now, at this point in time, this seems to be the wisdom that we have before us, but we could be wrong, And I think for whatever reason, our official teaching recognizes that, but the rhetoric of our bishops is always, as we've always taught, the unchanging teaching of our church. And I think that rhetoric is not very helpful, to be honest.
Right. And that's yes, that's really true. But it's hopeful to hear what you have to say. I'm glad to hear that. And you had mentioned the primacy of conscience, and I don't have time in our tete-a-tete interview to go into questions around conscience and assent, but maybe some of our attendees might have an interest in that, and you can certainly place a question in that notes box, folks, if you have a question around that. But I want to go to the issue of sexual ethics and gender identity ethics for a minute here. And I know you're not a sexual ethics theologian, but I still want to pursue this for a minute here. Half of us who are in the show tonight, according to the poll, are either transgender or gay or lesbian, and we have a real interest in how the hierarchical dimension of our church treats its LGBT brothers and sisters and families, and I hope to God that some of the bishops, at least privately and hopefully publicly, will say that, you know what, there's some wonderful theology that's challenging some of the vision that's already been in place, and we need to listen to that. And indeed, there's some wonderful theologians out there who are putting forth a sexual ethics that's inclusive and holistic and life-giving and doesn't ignore married couples who can't or don't have children or who are beyond child-rearing years. Theologies that really honor the commitment and fidelity and generativity of same-sex couples. There's really good stuff out there, and I'm wondering, my question to you, Professor, is what dimensions of sexual ethics that are inclusive, more inclusive, and that are more holistic, not so act-centered? What teachings do you think, or what ethics and what theological viewpoints do you think might have a chance to sort of find themselves in the official teaching of the church in the years ahead?
Yeah, boy, I don't know where to begin there. One of the difficulties is that it's only fairly recently that our Catholic Church has begun to undergo, I think, a Copernican revolution of sorts in the area of moral theology. And you've used some language that suggests that. We're only fairly recently beginning to understand that human nature is not some static, unchanging reality, that we humans live in history, and the experience of being human is dynamic, and we grow in our understanding of ourselves as we reflect on the world around us. And so, our understanding of what it means to be a human person is constantly changing, not just because of the scientific world, though that's particularly important, particularly in the area of science, but in the social sciences, what we learn from the field of psychology and sociology and so on and so forth. The Catholic Church has been slow to recognize that the experience of being human is dynamic and changing. We've tended to think of it in static, essentialist categories. And I think you're right. Moral theology is reminding us that you can't trap the human experience in these static categories. It's only really since maybe a few decades before the Second Vatican Council that we began to see a shift towards moral theology that focused on the human person, the goodness of the human person and human intentions and so on and so forth, and a shift away from a kind of artificial analysis of disembodied acts
Exactly.
Separated from any question of intentionality and context and so on. So that, that we're still working our way through that. And I think our church leaders at one level get it. Their rhetoric is very much person-centered and so on. But at the end of the day, when you look at our concrete teachings, those teachings were still articulated in a time when we focused very much on objective analysis of the moral quality of acts apart from relationships.
Right.
And I think the bishops are uncomfortable or nervous about what it would mean to allow a more person-centered moral theology to bring us to reassess that doctrine. But there's another piece to this, and it's a particular issue in sexual ethics, I think. There was a principle that really goes back to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century that the more specific you get in your moral teaching, the more you have to admit of exceptions. If you're going to stay at the general rule, it's easy not to have exceptionless norms. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's no exceptions to that, but that's real general. It's when you get to nitty-gritty teachings that focus on concrete issues that almost every norm is going to admit of exceptions, because no norm can anticipate every situation. Well, that's even more the case when you're talking about concrete teachings that deal with what we call contingent knowledge. In other words, where the church's teaching depends on our limited understanding of the world. And when we forget that fact, when we forget that the church's teaching depends on knowledge that's changing, we get in trouble. And the classic example of this was, of course, the Galileo affair, right? The Catholic Church was incapable of recognizing that some of its teaching depended on what scientists told them about the cosmos as they knew it. Sexuality is another example of this. We have to recognize that the church's teaching in the area of sexuality draws wisdom from our great tradition and from Scripture, from the teaching of Jesus, but it also depends on what we know about modern sexuality, and that's changed dramatically. Think about the science of human reproduction. It's only in 1825 that the ovum is discovered, right? It's only in the 1840s that people understand that a life is produced when the sperm from a male meets an egg from a female. This is 150 years ago. Catholic moral teaching was quite different before we understood the ovum. It had to change because our understanding of human reproduction changed. Well, I think in the area of sexual ethics, this is very much the case. What we know about human sexuality, what we know about orientation and the complex interaction between biological sex and socially constructed gender, these are very recent developments. And what you would wish, and I heard this in your voice, is that our bishops were less fearful, more open to say, look, we're not asking you to reverse church teaching right now. We're asking you to allow for an honest conversation where you dare to take in new insights, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be a good starting point.
And I want to implore you, and again, I know this isn't your particular area, but I want to implore you whenever possible, when you're with audiences, when you're writing, when you're talking to bishops, to plead that cause. You're a man with a golden tongue, and you can continue to have great influence over the baptized people of God, and they're the ones who are going to help create the change in the church. And what you can do is plant those seeds of them and give folks confidence to speak that truth.
Jim, I want to say they already are planting that change. When I look at the poll of the people sitting in here, the thing that I'm so moved by are the number of LGBT people that I have met who are Catholic who have said, I love my faith and my church too much to give up on it, even when it's treated me horribly, as it has in many ways. And I want to just exhort and encourage them not to give up on our church because of this. It is a human church. It is a pilgrim church now, guided by the Holy Spirit, to be sure. But it's still human. It's still broken. It's still sinful. And there is no other church out there that's any less that than ours. I really believe that. Every church is a human community, and it's going to be broken, and we're going to hurt people. I wish the church didn't, I remember one theologian saying the Catholic Church is the only human institution that shoots its wounded, And I wish we weren't so inclined to shoot our wounded, but I also want to encourage people not to give up on the church. I think our faith is worth fighting for. And the fact that in this area there is in many ways a grievous blind spot on the part of some of our church leaders and other well-meaning Catholics should encourage us to keep the conversation going, to continue to witness by our integrity that you can live the gospel faithfully as an LGBT person, and that you make important contributions to the life of the church.
Mm-hmm. And, that's a lot to ask sometimes, to stay in the church, but it's worth asking. It's worth asking.
I'm well aware of that, and I respect those who can't do it as well. I'm not in any way judging somebody who says, I just can't do this. This is a toxic environment. I would be the last person to deny that. But it would be the church's loss if people leave over that, because we lose the witness of LGBT Catholics who have a chance to teach the whole church something important about gospel values by staying at the table.
So, you don't know any loved ones who are gay, do you?
Well, I do. It turns out one of the sons who happens to be online here is gay. Yes, that's right. I have 4 boys, twins that are 23, David and Andrew, 19-year-old Brian, and 17-year-old Greg.
Very cool.
The youngest, by the way, are using this time to go watch TV downstairs, I'm sorry to say. They're less impressed with their father being in a webinar.
So, David is your son who's gay?
No, Andrew is my son who is gay.
So, Andrew, when he came out to you and to your wife, to his mother, was that a difficult thing for you? Did you have a process of coming out, of dealing with this?
Yeah. Well, it was more difficult for me than my wife. It sort of annoys the hell out of me, actually, that she handled it quite as easily as she did. I mean, she didn't miss a beat. I would like to think that I handled it well in my interaction with Andrew for a number of reasons. First of all, because I love my son, and I can't even imagine in any way loving him any of them any less because of this. But also because I recognized, the difficulties that I was having weren't at the theological level, first of all. I had already kind of come to terms with the fact that I had some issues with the church's teaching on this and was going to have to continue to faithfully wrestle with it for my lifetime. But, you deal with this at a more visceral, a gut level. It's not just at a head level, it's at a gut level. So, first of all, when I looked Andrew in the face and he shared this with us, I admired his courage for doing it. I admired his brother, who had told him not to tell us until he could be in town, David, his twin brother, to support him.
Nice.
His brother wanted to be there then, and I was very moved by that. I think most of us as parents, because of the culture in which we live, we grow up making assumptions that our children will be straight. And so we sort of project in our imagination certain futures for them, weddings and so on and so forth. And so there was a gradual dying to some of those things. I think the first time it really hit me emotionally, I was at lunch. I remember this very well with a very dear friend of our families, a parish priest who had meant a lot to us. And as I was talking about my experience with Andrew, I started talking about the grieving I was feeling over the fact that because of our church's teaching, Andrew would not, at least in the foreseeable future, be able to celebrate a formal Catholic wedding. And I just got choked up talking to him. It sort of put me in touch with the fact that, there's the kind of grieving that you do as a father, or mother or whatever, about images that you had, that you're going to let go of. And I just think a lot of times, there are layers to that acceptance. And, Andrew's been real patient with me and with his brothers in this regard, and recognized that, they're like stages to the acceptance. So there's the first stage when he comes out. Then there's the second stage, the first time he actually starts talking about being attracted to guys in front of us and commenting about somebody on TV. And then there's the stage when I find out he's actually in a relationship, and the stage where I see him affectionate with someone. And you sort of think, I got this down. And then there's some new thing that I realize, wow, I've got to kind of process that. And what was always clear to me is none of it was ever about Andrew. It was about me. It was about things I need to learn to accept. It was about, my own growth. And I'm fortunate that he's patient with me as I've gone through those stages of acceptance.
Sounds like you got a pretty good son there. Andrew, it's great to have you. His son Andrew is with us from Ecuador, all the way from Ecuador, so it's good to have you. I didn't bring you...
Houston. David's in Ecuador.
Excuse me.
Andrew's
excuse me, okay.
That's all right, we mixed it up too.
All right. So it is time to get to our participants' questions here, okay? So I'm going to shoot some at you, and if you want to be brilliant and quick, all right, with your answers, because we're going to try to get through a few of them here.
All right.
So somebody says, I read the document you were talking about now, and I'm concerned about this reinforcement of the ban on women's ordination and how it's not even open for debate. Oh, you addressed that. You addressed that. So never mind. From my reflections, it seems like the leadership, at least in the U.S., seem to be downplaying the significance of the things Pope Francis is saying. Is that your observation, and how do you respond to that?
I think that's my observation about many of the bishops. The U.S. episcopate began to undergo a shift in the late 1990s, and it continued in the first 13 years of since then. There were a goodly number of bishops, not all by any means, who took on a kind of culture wars attitude. They tended to almost demonize secular culture as godless and relativistic and anti-church and anti-family, and used a lot of, I think, polarizing language. That's not all of our bishops, but that's a lot of them. And they got a lot of support from Pope Benedict, who is a very holy man and a devout theologian and did a lot of good things. But he, too, saw the world in pretty starkly negative, almost apocalyptic terms at times. And so we now have a new pope with a very different approach towards how the church should interact with the world. And I think our bishops are going to begin to shift a little bit. We're seeing a modest change in rhetoric, but not as much as I would like. I guess I had hoped for a little bit more recognition that Francis is inviting them to a different style of leadership. He wants to see, them getting out of the chantries and having, and I love this image, a little bit more of the smell of the sheep on them.
Amen. You got it. Yeah, that's a great line. That is a great line, and he said it more than once. Okay, here we go. What
in this document too? Yeah.
What do you suggest for those of us who don't live? This is from I'm not sure, but from Rick, who don't live very close to an affirming parish and wants to be fed spiritually in the Catholic tradition. How does one go about finding a community? Any thoughts there?
Boy, I suspect that person would probably get more counsel from other people who've tried to be in that situation. I mean, it is tough if you're not in a place like that. And, I do think you need to find some kind of intentional community. Obviously, ideally, if you're a Catholic and you want to stay Catholic, you'd like that to be, in the Catholic fold. But there certainly are other Christian groups. And I hate to say this, but if you're in a parish setting that's particularly toxic in this regard, I mean, I think you have to be honest and say, maybe I need to go find at least temporarily a Christian community elsewhere that's going to be more supportive. Now, I think there are a lot of Catholic parishes that are supportive, and if possible, if you want to continue to nourish your Catholic faith, you want to do that as much as you can. But to have support, I mean, for our spiritual lives, we need, all of us need to be in a community that doesn't call our very being into question, that doesn't call the goodness of the problem is, see, in the Catholic Church, we think sexuality is tremendously important. We think it goes to the heart of who we are. We believe, that when Genesis says God created the first humans in the image and likeness of God, male and female, God created them, and God saw that it was good. our sexuality images God. So it's incredibly important to be in a community that tells us our sexuality is good. You know, I mean, of all the things I wanted my son Andrew to understand, that's what I want him to know above all else is you were created as a gay man good, and you image God through your sexuality. Now, you live it faithfully, but find a community that helps you live that.
And that's why Dignity communities sprung up some 40-some years ago is to provide people with exactly that.
And that's
celebrate the wholeness and So we've got some issue with the notes page here, and so some folks, it's not working for us well. So some folks are putting their questions in the chat box, and I appreciate that. Jane, you had a question, but I don't see it in the chat box. And then Brad from Louisiana asks, what percentage do you think of the American bishops are competent theologians? Okay.
That's tough. I got to work with these people. Well, look, the U.S. Church has a different tradition on this score. In Western Europe, there is a long-standing, centuries-old tradition of making some of their most distinguished theologians bishops. Pope Benedict was one of those. He was, a very distinguished theologian at Tübingen and then Regensburg when he was briefly made Bishop of Munich. Bishop Karl Lehmann in Germany, a very famous theologian made bishop. Bishop Walter Kasper. That has never been the tradition in the United States, and it never has. At our best, we made good pastors. For a long time, we made good pastors bishops. Now we're inclined to draw our candidates for the episcopate from seminary rectors, chanceries, and priests who've worked in Vatican dicasteries. Now, it's considered sort of PC right now in the episcopate for every cleric who's got any kind of career aspirations to go get a Roman degree so they can say they have a doctorate. All right? Mm-hmm. So a significant number of our bishops do have a doctorate, almost always from Rome. I don't want to belittle that. There's some good theologians and good faculties in Rome, but there also are some ways to go get a quickie doctorate, and then you can say that all these bishops are theologians. But from my point of view, in the more strict sense of the word theologian, a theologian is a professional theologian who received a terminal degree in theology, took an academic post, and actually published articles that are peer-reviewed and books that are peer-reviewed and developed a reputation that way, which is a lot more than just going to get a degree. If that's your criteria, there are very few. I can count on one hand the number of bishops in the U.S. Church that were respected, publishing theologians before they were made bishop. There are just very few of them. That doesn't mean they're bad people, okay? Because the vocation of the theologian and the vocation of the bishop are very different. I don't have a problem with a bishop not being a theologian. I actually have more of a problem with a bishop who thinks he's a theologian and really isn't. They're the problems.
We'll deal with them, will you? Is there a connection? Jane asks, is there a connection between the hard attitude of the Curia officials and the so-called gay lobby as depicted by Vanity Fair? Is there a connection between the hard attitude of the Curia officials and the so-called gay lobby as depicted by Vanity Fair?
I'm going to come at this a different way. First of all, because I don't know that many people in the Curia, so I can't speak to the gay lobby. Though I will, just a very brief anecdote about the whole thing in the Curia. John Henry Newman, the great 19th century English theologian, was made cardinal late in his life. And he was once asked why, in his long and distinguished career, he'd only gone to Rome twice in his life. And he said, I always thought it best to follow the counsel of my father, who told me, queasy travelers ought not visit the engine room. And the Vatican is sort of the Catholic engine room, and, you got to have a strong stomach to go there sometimes. But look, I do think that there's a more complicated issue, and it's in chanceries and it's in seminaries. And that is that a significant percentage of our bishops and priests are in fact gay. A more significant percentage than the larger population, I think a significantly larger percentage. They are, all of them, beloved children of God. But obviously, the vast majority of them are not honest with others about that, and maybe not with themselves about that. That's an unhealthy situation. And if you have a significant number of clergy leaders who have a same-sex orientation and either feel they have to deceive others or themselves about it, that doesn't create the conditions for a healthy way of dealing with other people. And I think that is the elephant in the room when it comes to the church's teaching on sexuality. All right? That'll get me in trouble, but I feel like I have to just say it.
Nope, indeed, that's so true. So, another question. Do you believe that Pope Francis is getting ready in time to call a Vatican III to deal with complicated issues like women's ordination and LGBT relations and priests being allowed to marry?
No, I don't. That doesn't mean he won't, but I suspect he will not. One of the reasons for that is one of the themes that we've heard in his papacy, and this is a wonderful theme, is an ecclesial application of what we call the principle of subsidiarity, which is that all things being equal, decisions are best made at the local level and should only be made at a higher level when they can't be resolved at the local level. And I think Francis wants to see a lot more. In fact, he says this in Evangelii Gaudium, that he thinks the papacy needs to be converted from a sense that the Pope has to answer every question. And he thinks that there are a lot of important issues in the church that should be addressed at the local or the regional level. Right. And you mentioned a really good example of this. I think not the ordination of women, but priestly celibacy. I think that's going to ultimately happen at the regional level. I think it's very possible that a bishops' conference, perhaps from the third world where the priest shortage is particularly dire, is going to petition the Pope for permission on what we call ad experimentum basis, a provisional basis, to ordain mature married men to the priesthood. And I think the Pope would be much more happy to let that happen coming up from below, from a regional group of bishops, and grant it on a regional basis. I think in general, his sense is that the church works a lot better when more of its decisions are made in a less centralized way. And an ecumenical council is, has a value, and I'm a big believer that we need them, but my gut is that right now Francis would rather work with the existing bodies at regional levels rather than focus on an ecumenical council.
Yeah, he seems to be making that clear at several points in his papacy. So that's very good news. One more question. We have time for one more question. Right. Be nice to this guy. I think he's one of your son's friends. Though we haven't had much time for educated prediction, with Francis's change in style, is there a real hope that the bishops of the world will follow in his footsteps? So do you have hope that indeed the world's bishops will follow suit?
Well, I think, yes, I do. Now, how much? How much can they? I mean, bishops, they are what they are. They were chosen because they had a particular temperament. And I think I'm modestly optimistic that a good number of our bishops, not all, will perhaps be inspired by Francis to engage in a kind of change of heart that, frankly, Francis himself admitted he went through. One of the remarkable things from that recent interview with the various Jesuit journals is he admitted that he was kind of a jerk as a Jesuit superior earlier in his life. He went through a transformation. Bishop Oscar Romero did the same thing. And I think there are a lot of our bishops who are good men who I really think could be inspired by Francis to take a good hard look at their ministry. The trickier question, the important question, is going to be the appointment of new bishops. Right. I'm very concerned about whether Francis's vision is going to trickle down into the various mechanisms for how we choose bishops. Some of the recent appointments don't give me quite a lot of hope, or, I'm a little concerned about that.
Right. Well, let's ask the folks who have joined the show, how hopeful are you that the institutional Catholic Church will become a more inclusive, transparent, and welcoming community? Click on the circle you think best fits your position, and then submit your vote.
Well, I'm glad to belong to the majority there.
Whoops. Whoops. Sorry about that. I don't, what happened there? Sorry about that. It left us. Try that again, folks. Thank you. So folks looks like most of us are cautiously hopeful. Well, we are near the end of the hour, and I am just, as always, so energized by your passion and conviction and good mind and strong heart in the ways of faith, Professor Gaillardetz, and really appreciate your being with us. Sometimes it's not a very not a very safe thing for folks who are in the public eye to appear on Dignity USA's media channels, but you were more than happy to do it, and I imagine your son Andrew had a little bit to do with that, and so we thank him for making you open to this. And I just want to thank you for the work that you do, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of the folks who have attended today.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It was a pleasure to be on the show, and I want to thank my sons for being on and supporting me as well there.
And you can stay on, Professor, if you like. I'm going to just make a little bit of announcement. In just a minute or so, you are going to be invited to do a survey, and it'll take about 20 seconds for you to complete that survey, or 30 seconds maybe. So please do so at the end of this. I want to bring your attention to Fortunate Families, which is a ministry by and for Catholic parents of LGBT children. It's one of the church's best kept secrets. So any parents on the line here who could use to either be ministers or be ministered to, this is a great place to go. And I know that there were folks who have been on the Fortunate Families board who were on tonight. So good to have you, and thank you for your crucial ministry. And I want to invite you to our next QCF show in December. We're going to feature a thriving community in San Diego, a Dignity community in San Diego. What makes them tick? What are their challenges? What does it mean to be an authentic Catholic community? So that'll be an interesting show. We've got 3 of the members showing up on that one. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been great to have you from across the nation, in Canada and across the pond, and wishing you a happy Thanksgiving and safe travels, especially to those of you who are traveling in and out of the East Coast. So be careful out there and be safe. Again, thank you, Professor. God bless you all, and you should be receiving that survey very quickly here. Good night, folks.